The Unfinished Tapestry and the Missing Artist, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a tapestry left unfinished, its final threads hanging loose in a quiet cottage where the artist vanished without warning. The work was meant to be her masterpiece, carefully woven with scenes from village life, yet those who studied it closely claimed it seemed to change, revealing details that made some people uneasy. When days pass and the artist does not return, the village assumes she has simply run away, but Miss Marple notices what others overlook: the missing tools, the rushed final stitches, and the sense that the tapestry was abandoned, not left behind. As Miss Marple studies the unfinished work, she realizes the tapestry is more than art, it is a record of secrets, stitched carefully into fabric, exposing moments someone never meant to be seen. And as the search for the missing artist deepens, one truth becomes clear: the final picture was never meant to be completed because it revealed far too much. Before we unravel the threads of this haunting mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more Miss Marple stories on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Unfinished Tapestry. The village of St. Mary Mead was proud of its silences. They were the sort of silences that settled gently over hedgerows and cottages, that lingered in the pauses between church bells, that wrapped themselves around afternoon tea like a shawl drawn close. It was a village that believed nothing truly dreadful could happen without making a great deal of noise first. That belief was mistaken. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window of her sitting room, her knitting needles resting idle in her lap, her eyes fixed not on her work but on the narrow lane beyond the garden gate. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the stones dark and gleaming, and now the late afternoon light caught in the puddles like fragments of broken glass. She had noticed, with quiet certainty, that the lane felt different today. It was not something she could explain easily. It was simply that the village, so carefully composed, had developed a flaw. Like a pattern woven too tightly in one place, too loosely in another. Like a tapestry left unfinished, its loose threads trailing where a careful hand had once worked. Miss Marple did not like loose threads. Across the room, a half-finished cushion lay draped over the arm of a chair. Miss Marple glanced at it, then back toward the lane. Patterns mattered. When a pattern was broken, it was rarely an accident. The postman had already passed. The baker's van had not appeared. And yet, at precisely 4:04, a figure should have come into view, walking briskly toward Rosebank Cottage with a portfolio tucked under one arm. Arthur Bell never missed that walk. Arthur Bell, the village artist, had been as reliable as the church clock. Every afternoon, regardless of weather, he walked from his small studio near the old mill to Rosebank Cottage, where he took tea with Mrs. Harriet Bell, his elder sister. He walked with purpose, his head inclined slightly forward, as though already lost in thought. Today, the lane remained empty. Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting, slowly, deliberately, but her eyes stayed on the path. People did not vanish without reason. They drifted away, they announced departures, they left notes pinned carefully to mantelpieces. Vanishing, true vanishing, belonged to a different category altogether. At Rosebank Cottage, Mrs. Bell was growing anxious. Harriet Bell had placed the teapot on the table, adjusted the cups, and glanced at the clock for the 4th time in as many minutes. She was not a nervous woman by nature. Years of living with her brother's absent-minded ways had trained her patience well. Still, Arthur was late. She stepped to the window and peered down the lane, her reflection pale against the glass. Nothing. No familiar figure, no hurried step. Just the hush of damp earth and distant birds. "It's not like him," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Arthur Bell was a man of habits, and habits were comforting things. They gave shape to days, reassurance to those who relied upon them. Arthur's habits were known to everyone in St. Mary Mead. His morning walks. His afternoon teas. His long hours at the loom in his studio, working on the tapestry that had become the quiet pride of the village. The tapestry. Harriet's unease deepened. That tapestry was never left unattended. Arthur treated it not merely as a work of art, but as a living thing. He spoke of it as though it listened, as though it responded to his hands and thoughts. To leave it unfinished at the end of a day was acceptable. To abandon it entirely was unthinkable. She reached for her coat. By the time Harriet Bell arrived at the old mill, the sky had begun to dim. The mill stood slightly apart from the village, its stones darkened by age and moss, its windows tall and narrow. Arthur had converted the lower floor into his studio, filling it with light, fabric, and the steady rhythm of work. The door was ajar. Harriet paused, one hand still on the handle. Her heart gave a small, unwelcome thump. Arthur never left the door open. "Drafts disturb the threads," he said. "A careless breeze could undo hours of careful weaving." "Arthur," she called. Her voice echoed faintly inside. She stepped in, the scent of wool and dye greeting her, familiar and comforting, yet now tinged with something else. Something unfinished. The loom stood at the center of the room, dominating it, the tapestry stretched across its frame. Harriet approached slowly. The tapestry depicted the village green, rendered in astonishing detail. The church spire rose proudly at one end, cottages clustered beneath it, figures mid-movement, frozen in the act of living. It was Arthur's great work, spoken of in neighboring towns, admired by visitors who came specially to see it. But now, at its lower edge, the threads hung loose. Arthur had been working when he stopped. The last section showed a figure only half formed, the outline suggested but not completed. The hands were missing. The face was nothing more than a pale suggestion. Harriet touched the hanging threads, then withdrew her fingers sharply, as though she had touched something too fragile. On the work table beside the loom lay Arthur's notebook, open. She leaned closer, reading the neat, careful handwriting. No farewell. No explanation. Just sketches, notes about color and texture, and a single sentence, underlined twice. Some patterns are not meant to be finished. Harriet straightened, a chill creeping up her spine. It was then that she noticed the silence. Not the peaceful village silence she knew so well, but a heavier one, pressed down upon the room. The kind that follows a sudden absence. Arthur Bell had not simply stepped out. He was gone. The news spread quickly through St. Mary Mead, as such things always did. By evening, speculation had woven itself into the fabric of village conversation. Some spoke of a sudden inspiration, a need to travel. Others whispered of debts, of secrets. A few suggested accidents, the river near the mill, the slippery stones. Miss Marple listened. She sat in her usual place at the vicarage that evening, hands folded, head slightly inclined, as voices rose and fell around her. She asked no questions. She rarely did. People revealed far more when they believed they were speaking freely. What interested her most was not what was said, but what was avoided. No one mentioned the tapestry. No one spoke of the unfinished figure. And no one seemed willing to ask why a man so devoted to routine would abandon the work that defined his life. Later that night, Miss Marple walked home beneath a sky heavy with cloud. As she passed Rosebank Cottage, she noticed a light still burning in the front room. Harriet Bell sat alone inside, her silhouette rigid, unmoving. Miss Marple paused at the gate. Patterns, she reflected, did not break themselves. Somewhere in the village, a thread had been pulled. And until it was traced to its source, the tapestry of St. Mary Mead would remain dangerously incomplete. She turned toward home, already certain of one thing. Arthur Bell's disappearance was not the beginning of the story. It was the missing stitch that revealed everything else. Chapter 2, The Threads No One Saw. Morning came to St. Mary Mead with deceptive gentleness. The sun rose pale and mild, brushing the village roofs with light as though nothing were amiss, as though a man had not vanished in the middle of his life, leaving his work breathing unfinished in a cold studio by the mill. Birds sang. Doors opened. Kettles boiled. And beneath it all, unease settled quietly, like dust no one wished to disturb. Miss Marple woke earlier than usual. She sat upright in bed, hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. She had slept poorly, not from fear but from the persistent sense that something had been overlooked. Disappearances, she knew from long experience, were rarely about the missing person alone. They were about the people left behind, and the small, telling changes in their behavior. By 8:30, she was dressed and ready, her cardigan buttoned, her hat set precisely. She paused before leaving, glancing once more at her knitting basket. Loose threads again caught her attention, and she frowned faintly. The village green was already busy when she arrived. Small groups stood talking in low voices, heads inclined, glances darting toward anyone who passed too close. News had traveled further overnight. Visitors from neighboring villages had arrived under the pretense of errands, but with curiosity plainly written on their faces. Miss Marple moved through them like a gentle current, smiling politely, listening carefully. "Ran off, I expect," said Mr. Clements, the butcher, with forced certainty. "Artists are like that. Restless types." "Not Arthur," replied Mrs. Wills sharply. "He never even went on holiday." "Perhaps that's exactly why," another voice added. "A man bottled up too long." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she disagreed with every word. People who bottled things up did not usually leave doors ajar or notebooks behind. They planned. They prepared. Arthur Bell had done neither. She turned toward the mill. The police had arrived earlier that morning. A single car stood outside, its presence both reassuring and unsettling. Sergeant Willis, a capable but unimaginative man, stood near the entrance speaking with Harriet Bell. Harriet looked smaller than she had the day before, her shoulders drawn inward, her eyes rimmed with red. Miss Marple waited until the conversation ended before approaching. "My dear Harriet," she said softly, touching the woman's arm. "You must take care of yourself." Harriet managed a thin smile. "I don't know what else to do, Jane. Everything feels wrong." Miss Marple glanced toward the mill door. "May I see the tapestry again?" Harriet hesitated, then nodded. "If you think it will help." "They've already looked at it, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. Inside, the studio felt colder than it had the day before. The loom stood exactly as Harriet had left it, the unfinished tapestry hanging like a held breath. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the loose threads at the bottom edge. Sergeant Willis cleared his throat. "We don't think it's relevant, Miss Marple." No sign of a struggle. No blood. No forced entry. "No," Miss Marple said mildly. "But absence can be quite as informative as presence." She moved closer, studying the work inch by inch. Arthur's skill was unmistakable. Each stitch was deliberate, controlled, thoughtful. There was no sign of haste in the work itself, which suggested that whatever had interrupted him had done so suddenly, without warning. Her gaze lingered on the unfinished figure. "Who is this meant to be?" she asked. Harriet shook her head. "I don't know. Arthur never said. He was secretive about the final section." Sergeant Willis shifted his weight. "Artists like mystery." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but they rarely leave it incomplete unless compelled." She reached out, not touching the fabric, but pointing gently. "This figure is positioned slightly apart from the others. Do you see? Everyone else faces inward, toward the green. This one turns away." Harriet stared. "I hadn't noticed." "Most people don't," Miss Marple said. "They see the picture as a whole. But patterns often reveal themselves only when examined closely." Sergeant Willis frowned. "Are you suggesting the tapestry means something specific?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that Arthur Bell was trying to tell a story." They left soon after. The police had other duties, other inquiries. Miss Marple returned to the village, her mind busy. She began with the people who had seen Arthur last. Mrs. Peters, who lived near the mill, recalled hearing voices the previous afternoon. "Not loud," she said. "Just tense." "What sort of voices?" Miss Marple asked. "A man's voice." "Another one, too." "Not angry exactly." "Careful." Careful voices were rarely harmless. At the shop, Miss Marple learned that Arthur had purchased extra thread 2 days earlier. Dark colors. Greys and muted blues. Said he was finishing soon, the shopkeeper remarked. Finishing. Or confronting something. By midday, Miss Marple had assembled a small collection of details that refused to sit comfortably together. Arthur had been uneasy. He had been watched. And someone else had known what he was working on. She took tea with Harriet that afternoon. The cottage felt hollow without Arthur's presence, every object slightly out of place. Harriet spoke haltingly, her thoughts circling the same point again and again. He had visitors recently, she said suddenly. People I didn't know. Miss Marple looked up. When? Last week. 2 of them. Separately. Did he say who they were? No. But one of them upset him. I could tell. Miss Marple set her cup down carefully. How? He argued afterward. Not with me. With himself, almost. Said some things were better left unfinished. The fray settled heavily between them. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and sat by her window once more. The lane lay quiet, but she no longer expected to see Arthur Bell walking it. Instead, she pictured the tapestry. A village frozen in thread. A figure turned away. Loose ends deliberately left. Somewhere, someone had seen themselves in that unfinished figure. And they had not liked what they saw. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. When art reflects truth too clearly, it becomes dangerous. And Arthur Bell, she suspected, had woven something someone was willing to silence him for. The tapestry was not merely unfinished. It was interrupted. And the person who interrupted it was still in St. Mary Mead, moving unnoticed, trusting that the missing artist would take the secret with him. Miss Marple reached for her knitting. There were threads no one else had seen yet. But she was beginning to find them. Chapter 3, the pattern finally revealed. The truth, Miss Marple reflected, rarely announced itself with drama. It did not arrive in sudden shouts or confessions, but settled instead like a picture slowly coming into focus. By the 3rd morning after Arthur Bell's disappearance, the image before her mind had grown uncomfortably clear. She sat at her small table, sunlight warming the edge of her teacup, her knitting resting untouched. In her thoughts, the tapestry lay spread out once more, every figure fixed in place, every thread deliberate. Arthur Bell had not woven scenes at random. He had been precise, almost painfully so. Each cottage, each tree, each person depicted carried meaning. And meaning, once recognized, could be dangerous. Miss Marple rose and prepared to leave the house. There was one place she needed to visit again, and one person who had been speaking far too carefully since the very beginning. The village liked to pretend that everyone knew everyone else, but in truth, St. Mary Mead was full of small secrets, quietly protected. The mill stood silent when she arrived, its stones cool and unwelcoming. Inside, the tapestry waited, unchanged, the unfinished figure still half-born in thread. Miss Marple moved closer, her eyes tracing its outline with practiced patience. The figure's posture was unmistakable now. Turned slightly away, shoulders angled defensively, as though retreating from the village scene behind it. It was not admiration Arthur had been weaving. It was accusation. She turned just as footsteps echoed behind her. "I thought I might find you here," said Mr. Leonard Finch. Mr. Finch was the chairman of the village council, a man admired for his efficiency, his generosity, and his impeccable manners. He stood now with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his expression one of polite concern. "Such a sad business," he continued. "Arthur Bell was a gifted man. A loss to us all." "Yes," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Especially to those who recognized themselves in his work." A faint tightening appeared around Finch's eyes, gone almost at once. "I'm not sure I follow." Miss Marple gestured toward the tapestry. Arthur Bell did not merely record appearances. He recorded truths. Quiet ones. Finch stepped closer, his gaze drawn unwillingly to the unfinished figure. Art is open to interpretation. Only up to a point, Miss Marple said. After that, it becomes recognition. She turned to face him fully. Arthur received visitors recently. People who wanted him to change what he was weaving. Finch smiled thinly. Artists are often pressured. Not like this, Miss Marple said. You visited him, Mr. Finch. Twice. The silence that followed stretched, heavy and telling. He was mistaken, Finch said at last. He misunderstood certain matters. Sensitive matters. Financial matters, Miss Marple replied. Funds redirected. Records altered. Decisions made quietly, with the assumption that no one would ever look too closely. Finch's smile faded. Arthur was a dreamer. He saw patterns where none existed. On the contrary, Miss Marple said gently. He saw them because they existed. She stepped aside, revealing the lower edge of the tapestry. This figure was you. Not your face, perhaps, but your posture. Your place. Standing apart from the village you claim to serve. Finch's voice hardened. You have no proof. Arthur did, Miss Marple replied. And he intended to display it publicly. The tapestry was to be unveiled at the summer fete. Finch's breath caught despite himself. He confronted you, Miss Marple continued, her voice steady, unyielding. He told you he would not alter the design. That the truth, once woven, could not be unwoven. Finch turned away, pacing. I asked him to wait. To reconsider. You frightened him, Miss Marple said. Not with threats of violence, but with consequences. Reputations ruined. The village divided. You believed fear would silence him. Finch stopped. He panicked. Yes, Miss Marple said. He fled. Not because he was guilty, but because he believed disappearing would protect his work. He hid the final section. Finch's head snapped up. What final section? Miss Marple smiled sadly. Exactly. The tapestry was incomplete because Arthur Bell had removed its ending. The missing portion, carefully cut away, held the proof Finch feared most. Arthur had hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere ordinary, trusting that someone patient enough would find it. It had taken Miss Marple less time than Finch imagined. Arthur's notebook, overlooked in its simplicity, contained more than sketches. Pressed between its pages was a folded piece of cloth, its edges neatly trimmed. Miss Marple withdrew it now from her handbag. The missing section showed the same figure again, but this time with hands visible, holding documents unmistakably marked with the village seal. Finch sank into a nearby chair. They would have believed him, he whispered. Over me. Yes, Miss Marple said. Because truth, when presented carefully, is very persuasive. The police arrived shortly thereafter. Finch did not resist. He offered no defense beyond silence. The village, when the story finally emerged, reacted with disbelief, then reluctant acceptance. St. Mary Mead would recover, as villages always did, but its innocence had been altered. Arthur Bell returned a week later. He arrived quietly, thinner, more tired, but resolute. The tapestry was restored under his supervision, its final threads woven with deliberate calm. When it was unveiled, the village saw not scandal, but honesty. And honesty, though uncomfortable, proved cleansing. Miss Marple watched from the edge of the green, her knitting in hand, her work finally complete. Patterns, she knew, always revealed themselves in the end. Some only required the courage to look. If you enjoyed the unfinished tapestry and the missing artist Miss Marple mystery, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with fellow lovers of classic detective stories. Your support helps bring more carefully crafted mysteries to life, and ensures that no story, no matter how quietly woven, is ever left unfinished.